What's going on, Dolphins? It is your boy Dillon, and got a few things to talk about today. It's all pretty much, centered around draft for the most part, obviously, because that's like the big thing coming up, and potentially even the last thing that we'll see this year of football, depending on how the rest of this craziness goes. So I want to read through a couple articles. There are 3 articles in particular that are talking about a few different things that I think are interesting. The first one involves the Cincinnati Bengals and their interest in Joe Burrow, etc., etc., and then obviously, that ties in with the Dolphins. We're going to talk about some of the biggest steals in draft history over the last decade, just because I think that is important, because it just goes to show you that you can get guys, even quarterbacks, in later rounds, and you don't have to chase players at all. You don't have to chase players at all. You can let the teams who want to chase players trade up, and you can trade back or just stay put. You can draft smart. You can draft best player available, and if you build your team correctly, and if you supplement in free agency and don't dole out big ass contracts that end up setting you up in cap hell, so that way, later down the road, when you do have, players that you drafted in-house that are going to be expecting big contracts, you might have to let them go because your cap space is just fucking depleted because you decided to run roughshod through it and just give out these massive, immense contracts, right? If you do things properly, then there's just a smart way to do things, and you don't have to chase guys, and then you can just draft. You can build in the medium that it makes sense to build through, and that's the draft. And then you can approach it, and your philosophy to it can be smart. And then finally, there's an article that was written about the Dolphins' history of picking number 5 that I want to go into, because that's interesting as well. So let's go ahead and start with it. The first one is from Bleacher Report. It's the article about Joe Burrow and whether or not the Cincinnati Bengals actually have an interest. So, Joe Burrow rumors. Latest buzz on Dolphins' interest in Bengals quarterback preference. There's some buzz coming out of Paul Brown Stadium that Joe Burrow may not be the consensus top pick among the staff in the Cincinnati Bengals front office. Now, real quick, let's just note that obviously part of this, part of the offseason leading up to the draft is just rumors. Now, here's the thing. A lot of these things could be true. Like, for example, the Dolphins have been reportedly the team that's done the most amount of homework on Justin Herbert. And recently they've been talked about as if, they'll take Herbert over Tua. Obviously, there was the whole tanking for Tua thing, right? And blah, blah, blah. We know that they love him, but there could be some medical concerns, especially since their doctor hasn't been able to look at him. There have been, plenty of reports that they love Joe Burrow, but there's, and there's reports that, oh, hey, maybe Jordan Love's actually, or Jalen Hurts, right? So, but a lot of these things could be true. They might like all these guys, right? But what it comes down to, and this is why I've said since the beginning, what's going to end up happening is the Dolphins are going to they are going to ensure that they get the quarterback that they love. So that's why there's definitely a million ways this could turn out. If it ends up being that, let's say, Jordan Love is the guy that they really love, then I think that they could stay at number 5, not trade up at all, and get Jordan Love at number 5. I think it would probably be, with my philosophy of never taking a quarterback in rounds 1 or 2, but always in round 3 or later, it would certainly be a reach. But, on how these things typically work, it would still probably be a reach to take him that high at number 5. He might be a late first round, or maybe a second round guy from what I've seen. So, but that's possible. However, I believe that Stephen Ross wants he wants whoever he views to be the best quarterback in the draft. Now, it could still be Tua, right? And a lot of people think that if you just look at, purely the quarterback and the talent they have, etc., Tua is better than Joe Burrow. And they think that minus the injuries, he would certainly be better. But as I've been saying for a while, these injuries are significant. Ankles and a hip that was worse than Barry Sanders' injury, right? And so, because again, his just partially popped out of the joint, whereas Tua's broke straight through the back wall of the joint, right? Anyway, so, and even though, he's got lots of good, reviews from doctors and things seem to be coming, together well, he seems to be moving well, he's also, generally speaking, an undersized quarterback with a pretty significant injury history already before he even gets to the hard-hitting NFL, okay? And then you got to take into consideration, well, is he going to go in right away or not? Is he going to have an offensive line that can adequately protect him so he doesn't have to fucking take as many chances of getting re-injured, etc., etc.? Okay, so, maybe Tua's not the guy, right? Maybe it ends up being Burrow, or maybe it ends up being Herbert. I think Herbert has especially recently gotten himself I think he was probably always in the top 3, but I think he's gotten himself closer, especially with Tua's injuries, etc., etc., that, he could be in the mix for a possible pick after trading up, right? So the Dolphins could trade up to number 3 and maybe take Herbert. Maybe they trade up to the number 1 spot and take Herbert there. That's possible. I think that's probably less likely, but certainly possible. Anyway, so there's tons of things that could happen, and obviously a lot of this stuff is, rumors and smoke screens and whatever, but it is also possible that a lot of this stuff is true, i.e. that they like a lot of these different guys. They probably like them all in some form or fashion, but what actually is going to come to fruition is the Dolphins will ensure that they go get whoever the quarterback is that Stephen Ross has fallen in love with. The one guy, and again, I've said this, it might not happen until minutes before the card is put in, but whoever Stephen Ross loves, they will get, and they will do whatever it takes to make sure that they get him. If they feel that they have to go to the number 1 pick to get whatever quarterback it is that they want, they will do that, and they will spare no expense. Because in Stephen Ross's history, he has proven that he thinks the answer to solving the Dolphins' problems on the field is by just throwing money and resources at it. And again, with the big contracts that we've seen this offseason, that trend is holding strong. The contracts they gave out are absurd. And so, especially like Byron Jones's contract, there's no way he can live up to the 5-year, $82.5 million deal that he got with like half the contract or more being guaranteed up front. It's absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, but let's continue on because I'm starting to get off on my own tangents. I want to get through these articles. While the LSU quarterback has sat atop draft boards since late November, Peter King of NBC Sports recently noted that not everyone in Cinci is sold, and there's another worthwhile option at quarterback should the team look to trade the first overall pick before the draft kicks off April 23rd. So, it's certainly possible that with injury history for Tua and, Herbert maybe not being the top tier quarterback in the draft, it's definitely possible that, there's been talk for a while now that the Dolphins and Bengals have been chatting and that the Bengals are willing to give, direct quotes from, the top brass of the Bengals have said, we'll listen to people. We'll hear what they have to say, whatever. So it's certainly possible that the Dolphins could trade up to the number 1 spot to get Burrow. And I actually think that at this particular point in time, that is the most likely situation that will come to bear. I've heard that there are some inside the Bengals who are true believers in Justin Herbert, King wrote. If so, such a deal could be intelligent for Cincinnati, but we'll see how it goes. Burrow has the toughness and ability and mental acuity to be a very good long-term quarterback. Bleacher Report's Matt Miller has Herbert as the third quarterback coming off the board in his latest mock draft, going to the Los Angeles Chargers with the number 6 pick. Now, let's also note, though, that some of these other teams behind us, Chargers, Jags, Panthers, are going to be playing for some of these quarterbacks as well, which is going to drive up asking prices and also force teams, not the Dolphins, not even to necessarily give away more than they should. That will be in play. The Dolphins will likely trade up and give away more than what it's worth to ensure that they get that spot because of the outside pressure from other teams, but it'll force them to trade to begin with, right? Because if there's other teams that are going to trade above us, right? Because a couple years ago, all the top when we took Minkah Fitzpatrick, the year we took Minkah Fitzpatrick, the Cardinals traded up to the number 10th overall spot, one spot ahead of the Dolphins, and took Josh Rosen. So and that's recent history in Stephen Ross's mind. If he feels like one of those teams are going to trade up to the number 4 spot or the 3 spot or the 2 spot to get one of those top quarterbacks, then he's going to make sure that he's the one that pulls the trigger, and he's going to make sure that he's the one that has the best offer. Also, keep in mind, he's a businessman. So he thinks of it in that terms. He's got to have the best offer, and he's going to make sure that he does. Anyway, notably, that means the Bengals would pass on Tua Tagovailoa, whose health concerns have, after suffering a dislocated hip last season, have teams speculating on his long-term durability, should they trade down. If the Bengals want Herbert, they could easily take him at number 1, but that might be putting themselves at a disadvantage. There's already plenty of talk about the Miami Dolphins trading up to take Burrow with the first pick. Considering the Dolphins have 3 first-round picks this year, they have more than enough assets to make that happen, which makes the Herbert noise worth listening to. Yet such a deal still seems unlikely. I think it's actually far more likely than not, but there are tons of factors that could make this go in a million different directions. Speaking on ESPN's Get Up on Thursday, Dan Graziano acknowledged Miami's desire to reach an agreement with Cincinnati, but the Bengals may be done listening. So let's note that it is important to understand, the deeper context in people's words. It's important to understand the context and framing with which people use, right? So he acknowledges that Miami does have a desire to reach a deal with the Cincinnati Bengals to get that number 1 pick. But he says the Bengals may be done listening. Maybe they're done, but maybe they're not. At this point, the Bengals have given no indication that they're willing to move out of that pick. Okay, but that's at this particular point, and just because they've given you an indication or not doesn't mean that they will, right? Because some teams like to hold things close to the vest, some teams like to strategically put stuff out, blah, blah, blah. And there's rumors and talk about all the different possible scenarios, so it's not like the media is doing the job for them. It's not like they really need to throw lines out there to see who will take bait. The media is doing a good enough job, right? So they don't need to say what they really want to do, right? They can just let everybody else speculate. So who knows, right? They might not have given an indication, but that could be exactly what ends up happening. They intend to sit there at number 1 and take Joe Burrow. I think you're going to continue to hear this over the next 15 days. It's entirely possible that the Dolphins continue to improve their offer and get to the point where they entice the Bengals. But to this point, that has not happened. So, to this point. So that means that the Dolphins have, and we've, seen the reports, the Dolphins have been in talks, whatever. And so, the Dolphins have an offer. So, theoretically, that's going to involve, at least if they're trying to, lowball the Bengals, then they're going to give away at least 2 first-round picks, a 2nd-round pick, and maybe some later-round picks. Okay? But history has shown us, and with the draft value chart, they're likely going to have to give away at least 3 first-round picks, which would be at least 2 from this year, 1 from next year, and likely also a 2nd-round pick from this year, even just to match up from the draft value chart. So if the Dolphins have already put in a substantial offer like that and the Bengals have yet to take it, now, of course, there's still a little under 2 weeks to go, 11 days, okay, for this to play out, for these talks to heat up, for the offers to get larger, for other teams to be jumping up in the mix, right? Like, if the Dolphins are talking about the Bengals, with the Bengals, maybe there's teams talking to the Lions right now for the number 3 spot to ensure that they get one of the top quarterbacks. And maybe there are people talking to the Washington Redskins for the number 2 pick and the Giants for the number 4 pick, right? So that would put pressure on the Dolphins to increase their offer to the Bengals to ensure that they get the number 1 overall pick so they can ensure that they get the guy that they want. Especially then if there's also talk about teams heating up on Justin Herbert. And if the Dolphins really do have, significant reservations on Tua, they might not be willing to take him in the top 10, which I think is the smart thing to do in regard to him, right? So, I mean, there's a lot that, again, so many factors that go into this, but when you put it all together, to me, it equals the Dolphins trading up to the number 1 pick to get the quarterback that Stephen Ross covets, which I believe will most likely be Joe Burrow. If Cincinnati is just trying to get a better offer from the Dolphins, there are multiple risks to that game. The Bengals may not be the only team Miami is talking to about moving up in the draft, which is true. I'm sure that the Dolphins are one of the teams talking to the Redskins and to the Lions, etc. The Dolphins own the 5th, 18, and number 26 overall picks. If there's a quarterback the team wants other than Burrow, it may be willing to part with a smaller package than what it is offering the Bengals to grab him, per Graziano. And that's true. If the Bengals hold out too long, or if they get too, stingy or greedy, whatever, then maybe the Dolphins just pull the trigger to the number 3 pick. But as we've seen in previous videos, there are rumors and discussions and scenarios in which the Dolphins could trade up to the number 3 pick, then again trade up to the number 1 pick. So that's not off the table either. Although I don't know, because I'm not a GM, I'm not an executive in the NFL. I'm by no means an expert, but I would guess that the Bengals still have the majority of the leverage in this situation. And finally, they feel like if they sit at number 5 or if they trade up with the Detroit Lions to number 3, they can get a quarterback that they like, Graziano said, but it doesn't look at this point as if they're going to be able to move all the way up to the number 1 and get Joe Burrow. So, I mean, look, do they feel confident enough that they can get somebody at 5? I think with the pressure that's, other teams are putting on, etc., I think that they expect that, I don't know that Joe Burrow, Tua, and Herbert are all going to go in the top 5. I think, if anything, the most likely thing at this point would be that Tua actually drops out of the top 10 because of the concerns with his injury history, unless a team wants to take a flyer on him within the top 10. But within the top 5, I think it's likely to be Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert at this point. Who knows? Maybe the Dolphins, stay at number 5 and then trade up from 18. That's always possible. There's a million different things that are possible in this upcoming draft, and the Dolphins can do almost all of it. I mean, there's nothing that the Dolphins couldn't do if they really wanted to. All right, so let's move on to the next article that I wanted to talk about, also from Bleacher Report, and who are some of the biggest draft steals of the last decade. So, a few players go under the radar on every NFL draft and wind up having Pro Bowl caliber careers. They fall for a variety of reasons, sometimes through no fault of their own. But who among those gems provided the best value over the last decade? We limited our choices to players selected after the first 2 rounds. So not in the first 2 rounds, not in round 1 or round 2. So all of these players were at least in round 3 or later. First rounders such as Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, who have significantly outplayed their draft position, deserve credit, but we're interested in stars from later rounds. Positional value was a factor, as finding franchise quarterbacks late is nearly impossible, which is actually not true though. It's not true. And this is part of the reason why I'm reading this, because they prove that. Right? Because there are a couple significant quarterbacks in here that help to prove that. And again, the greatest of all time, or one of the most people consider to be the greatest of all time, Tom Brady, but certainly one of the greatest of all time, top 3, top 5 for sure, right? And I'm a Dolphins fan, and I hate saying that, but it's true, right? It's just factually true, even though they're also cheaters, but still, right? Like, I mean, he was not taken in the first 2 rounds. So it's right, because if you want to say that, right, if you want to say that, then you can say the exact same thing about taking a quarterback in round 1. It's nearly impossible to get your franchise guy in round 1 or 2. It is, because that's what history has shown us. The vast majority of them either end up being busts or just all right or average or just float around teams or end up being backups or what have you. The vast majority of them, right? And then on top of that, though, when you take a guy in the first round, then they have a higher price tag just naturally because of draft order, right? And the pay scale based on where they get picked. And then additionally, the pressure that gets put on them. And that's part of the reason why, right? Because I'd rather take a guy later on and have him exceed the expectations than chase a guy and have him, drastically fall short of the expectations, right? Anyway, so let's see. But draft position will also be considered, since players found late on day 3 will carry more value than others taken inside the top 100. Here are the 10 best picks of the NFL draft since 2010. First, they do some honorable mentions. So they have T.Y. Hilton from the Colts at pick number 92 from 2012. In 2011, Jarrell Casey for the Titans at number 77. Justin Houston for the Chiefs in 2011, pick number 70. Kirk Cousins, quarterback. Obviously not, a superstar, but definitely been a really good, solid quarterback in this league. But he was picked at 102 in 2012. Everson Griffin of the Vikings, number 100 overall in 2010. DeMarco Murray of the Cowboys at 71 in 2011. Jimmy Graham for the Saints, number 95 overall in 2010. Keenan Allen of the Chargers, 76 overall in 2013. Cam Chancellor of the Seahawks, number 133 in 2010. Stephon Diggs of the Vikings, he's now on the Bills, of course, because he just got traded. Pick number 146 in 2014. George Kittle, 49ers, 146 overall in 2017. David Johnson of the Cardinals, 86 overall in 2015. Tyrann Mathieu of the Cardinals, 69th overall in 2013. Alvin Kamara of the Saints, number 67th overall in 2017, and Akeem Hicks of the Saints, 89th overall in 2012. Now, but if you note, right, obviously the vast majority of these guys, in particular, the honorable mentions, and certainly most of the guys in their top 10 are not quarterbacks, but there are a few of them in there, okay? But the point of this is, and look at the teams that pick these, right? You have like the Saints, the 49ers, the Seahawks, Chargers, Cowboys, Vikings, Chiefs, right? Most of these teams are smart teams with how they, handle their draft and how they handle free agency, and they don't typically give out, the big free agent signings, et cetera, et cetera. And so what ends up happening is they have a little bit more, wiggle room to be able to take guys later and be able to draft and develop, et cetera, et cetera. They can just draft comfortably without having to chase certain players, because they have so many needs on the team and blah, 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 because they fall into some stupid philosophy that all you need is a quarterback, et cetera, et cetera. And then they're able to just comfortably find these gems. Anyway, so 10 is David Bakhtiari from the Packers, 109 overall in the 2013 draft. I'm not going to read through the actual descriptions of these guys except for the quarterbacks. Because there's a couple points that I want to make here. This is one, that you don't need to chase players, period, and that you can get stars throughout the draft at all positions, but at quarterback, you can get stars or guys that are gonna, win you football games, that give you a chance to win your division, to win the conference and to get to the Super Bowl, even if they're not, greatest of all time or super elite status, right? in later rounds. You don't have to chase a quarterback in round 1 or 2. Anyway, number 9 is center Jason Kelce of the Eagles, picked 191 overall in 2011. Then you have Travis Kelce of the Chiefs at number 8, picked 63rd overall in 2013. Navarro Bowman of the 49ers, 91st overall in 2010. Tyreek Hill of the Chiefs, 165th overall in 2016. Geno Atkins of the Bengals, 120th overall in 2010. Okay, number 4 on their list is Dak Prescott of the Cowboys, picked number 135th overall in 2016. There aren't many day 3 picks who wind up as opening day starters during their rookie seasons, and certainly not at quarterback. However, Dak Prescott has proved time and time again that he isn't a typical day 3 pick. But Dak Prescott, and he's one of the guys that I will generally bring up when I talk about quarterbacks from later rounds. Another one that I talk about is also in this list. I believe he's the number 1 on the list, okay? But it proves the point, right? And there are, percentage-wise, overall, just as many good to great quarterbacks in the later rounds, including one of the greatest of all time, as there are in the first rounds, right? Because if you look at the percentage of first round quarterbacks that end up being busts or just average, as opposed to the percentage that end up being superstars, franchise quarterbacks, greatest of all times, blah, 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 right? That percentage is probably similar to the percentage that of quarterbacks that are picked in later rounds that also become superstars, as opposed to the ones that become, right? So you compare the percentage of quarterbacks that end up being franchise guys or, superstars, etc. in the later rounds to the amount of quarterbacks that become franchise guys in the first rounds. And it's probably pretty similar as opposed to the overall percentage in which way they go, right? So I don't know if I explained that part at all. Clearly, I don't think I did, if I'm being honest with myself, but hopefully you guys get what I'm saying. You can find quarterbacks in the late rounds just as easy as the first rounds, and you don't need to chase guys, etc. I've said all those things a million times. When Dallas Cowboys starter Tony Romo was injured during a 2016 preseason game, Prescott was named the team's interim starter, but he played so well that the Cowboys stuck with him even when Romo was ready to return, and Prescott led the Cowboys to the NFC's number 1 seed. He has started every game for the Cowboys since and has never had a losing season. He's a 2-time Pro Bowler, and his game is only improving. In 2019, he threw a career-high 30 touchdowns and added 3 on the ground. He boosted his yards per attempt to 8.2 and had a passer rating of 99.7. Soon he will likely be one of the league's highest paid players, and it's tough to argue against that as it appears the 4th rounder hasn't hit his ceiling. Number 3 is Antonio Brown of the Steelers, 195 overall in 2010. 2 is Richard Sherman of the Seahawks, 154th overall in 2011. And number 1 on the list is quarterback Russell Wilson, another quarterback that I talk about, picked in later rounds that ended up being the guy, right? Pick number 75th overall in 2012. While there have been dozens of draft steals over the last decade, Russell Wilson was the biggest of them all. Also, though, let's note, though, that the Seahawks have kind of fallen off in years, so even the great quarterbacks, it still proves another point that even the great quarterbacks, they need help around him, right? They haven't had the Legion of Boom in a little while, so their defense has not been as scary as it used to be, and Russell could use some help in, the skill positions around him and so on and so forth. So we'll see how they go there, but even the best of the best still need help, right? Even Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady aren't going to be, aren't the same guys if they're not in the same situations. I personally believe that you're going to see, I don't think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to make it to the Super Bowl just simply because they have Tom Brady. Anyway, despite putting up huge numbers at 2 colleges, NC State and Wisconsin, Wilson fell to the 3rd round because of a lack of height. Measuring in at 5'11", he didn't hit the arbitrary 6-foot threshold that many teams still use. Not only did Wilson start 4 years in college and average 7.9 yards per passing attempt, but he also tested as an elite athlete. Real quick, let's note that he and, let's say, Drew Brees are quarterbacks that are typically looked at as smaller in stature and size, atypical to what they generally look at for quarterbacks that are massively successful. Okay, Brees obviously more so, but he's obviously a lot older than, or significantly older than Wilson at this, so, and further in his career at this point. So there's that, and that's part of it. But it's also pretty rare. And when you look at the overall numbers and the overall, quarterbacks and how tall, their size, et cetera, right? There's hand size and shit like that too. But Russell Wilson didn't have anywhere near the injury history like, let's say, Tua does. So size isn't everything, but it is a factor, and every situation is different. Right? Does he have the size issues and also have a significant injury history? Russell Wilson never had that from my understanding, right? Brees had some injury history, yes, but not as many injuries and certainly not as bad. He had some shoulder problems, okay? From what I understand, some shoulder issues, but that wasn't surgery on both of your ankles and your hip in a time where quarterbacks are expected to be exceptionally mobile. Super different, right? Super different. To be fair, it was, shoulder injury in a time where, well, no, that's not even true, because back then, the running game was a lot more involved and they had real ground and pound. So you didn't necessarily, it's a lot more pass happy nowadays, honestly, but they also want quarterbacks to be super mobile. So it's almost all on quarterbacks at this point. Anyway, with the way a lot of the rules are in some ways. Anyway, so point is it's not all about the size, but it depends on the rest of the context as well, right? Because every single case is different. Every individual circumstance is different. No, there are no two circumstances 100% the same. Anyway, let's see, where was I? Not only did Wilson start 4 years in college and average 7.9 yards per passing attempt, but he also tested as an elite athlete. I read that. He ran a 4.55 40-yard dash and had the second best 20-yard shuttle time among quarterbacks. Wilson beat out Matt Flynn as a rookie and has started every game since. Not only has he won a Super Bowl and been to another, but the Seahawks have had a winning season every year since drafting him. And that's good, right? And again, goes to show you that you don't have to get a guy in the first or second round. He's become one of the league's most dynamic quarterbacks over the last 3 seasons, but they do need to help him so they can get back to the level of prominence that they would like to be. Throwing 100 touchdowns and just 23 interceptions despite playing behind a poor offensive line, Wilson has 6 Pro Bowls under his belt and is still getting better. Finding starting caliber quarterbacks after the first few rounds is incredibly difficult, but finding Super Bowl winning passers after the top 60 picks happens just once every few decades. And so yes, it's hard to find the guy at quarterback, but that applies to the later rounds and the early rounds, not just the later rounds. It applies no matter where you get a quarterback. So it doesn't matter. Anyway, and finally, the last I want to talk about is an article on Dolphins Wire by Kyle Krabs, and it's the history of the Dolphins at the 5th overall pick. The Miami Dolphins draft capital entering the 2020 NFL Draft is about as expansive as any team in recent memory. With 14 picks currently on the Dolphins' schedule and next 2 weeks in the next week's draft, the Miami Dolphins are set to draft as many players as the team has hauled over the last 2 years worth of drafts, 2018 and 2019 combined. That's if they pick 14 players, or if they pick more because they trade back. But if they give away 5 or 6 picks to get up to the number 1 spot or what have you, then obviously they will only be picking 8 or 9 players at that point. And that's if they don't do more trades after that. Of course, they could also trade back after that and then accrue more capital. That's possible as well, but we'll have to see. Anyway, it's fun to imagine. The Dolphins have added Christian Wilkins, Mike Gesicki, Jerome Baker, Jason Sanders, and former Dolphin Minkah Fitzpatrick over that time span. Okay, hold on. Let's pause real quick, though. Christian Wilkins was the first-round pick from the current regime and has been underwhelming to this point. Mike Gesicki, I think, was a really good pick. He was picked to be a pass-catching tight end, but he was picked by the Gase regime and became a better blocker because of the Gase regime, which in part helped him to get more time as a pass-catching tight end, as opposed to being, put a lot into the blocking schemes because he had to improve on it. Jerome Baker was a Gase pick. Jason Sanders was a Gase pick. Minkah Fitzpatrick a Gase pick. So I'm not sure exactly what he's saying there. I mean, most of those are really good picks. Christian Wilkins could still end up being a good pick. He was underwhelming, but he could still end up being a good pick. But most of those were good picks, but those were Gase picks. I agree that there's some of the better picks that they've had over the past few years. I'm not sure what he's saying, though. If the team adds an equal level of talent to the team with their heavy dosage of picks, it shouldn't be hard to envision this Dolphins team gearing up for late season challenges to make the postseason sooner rather than later. If they do things properly, if they do things smart. I don't have confidence in them to do it. Again, they can prove me wrong, and I hope they do. I personally don't have the confidence that they're going to do it. But look at what he's saying there, though. He's saying that if they pick like they picked in the Adam Gase days, because almost all of those picks were from the Adam Gase era, except for Christian Wilkins, who hasn't proven to be, much of anything at this point. Again, to be fair to him, it was just his rookie season. It was a bad team, bereft of talent, etc., and he still could, improve and be a force. But he was underwhelming. So he's essentially saying that. Anyway, I'm not saying it. He's saying it. He's saying that they need to pick and get talent to the level that they had during the Adam Gase days. Okay. I mean, I would agree with that. I really liked the Adam Gase drafts. So I would totally be on board with that. I don't think they're going to do that because, again, I think they're going to trade away significant capital, to go chase a quarterback, etc. I don't think that they did the smart thing in free agency, just doling out big contracts to players that I don't think are going to live up to them, etc., overpaying, blah, blah, blah. So we'll see. We'll see. It's not the approach that I would have taken. I would have done everything different. Again, I wouldn't have fired Adam Gase. I would have given him a second year. But even if you thought it was time to change, the regime up, whatever, I still wouldn't have done the fire sale. I wouldn't have tanked. I would have done last year's draft totally different, etc. And they, for the most part, proved me right last year. I was wrong about a couple things for sure, but for the most part, I was proven correct. Let's see how this year goes. But what does team history tell us about some of these top selections? The Dolphins picked 4 times in the top 40, barring a trade, of course. How much success have the Dolphins had in drafting talents in each of those respective spots in the past? It's time for a history lesson. The last time the Miami Dolphins held the 5th overall pick, well, it's never happened. As a matter of fact, going all the way back to 1966, the Dolphins have only ever made 6 selections in the top 5 overall picks of any draft. And the first 3 were made in the team's first and second seasons of existence as a part of the AFL draft. The Dolphins owned the first and second overall picks of the 1966 draft and picked running back Jim Grabowski from Illinois and quarterback Rick Norton from Kentucky. Neither played past 1971. In 1967, the Dolphins drafted quarterback Bob Greasy with the 4th overall pick. Greasy played 14 seasons, quarterbacked the Dolphins to glory throughout the team's 1970s dynasty, and found his way to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So obviously we know Bob Greasy is one of those 1 in a million guys. You have to wait until 2005 for the next time the Dolphins picked inside the top 5. and made a pick there for the first time in an NFL draft. The team drafted running back Ronnie Brown with the 2nd overall pick that year. He went on to log over 7,000 yards from scrimmage and 42 touchdowns, finishing his career as the Dolphins' 3rd all-time leading rusher. Just 3 years later, Bill Parcells infamously passed over quarterback Matt Ryan in favor of offensive tackle Jake Long when the Dolphins made just their 2nd ever 1st overall selection. And in 2013, the Dolphins traded up to the 3rd overall selection to draft linebacker Dillon Jordan, who will forever be remembered as one of the team's biggest draft busts. In short, the Dolphins haven't had much experience drafting in the top 5, but they'll get to show their mettle and doing so under this regime next week. But look, quickly, they have Greasy, which is obviously the best. Then you have Ronnie Brown, significant player for the Dolphins. But then after that, and Jake Long even was a really good player for us for the short time that we had him. But it tapers off, right? And then obviously then the other extreme is Dillon Jordan being just a total fucking bust. So, but there is not a lot of history to go off of, Dolphins history. But of course, you also have to take into consideration though that a couple things. Well, the ownership was different, the regimes were different, right? Like Bob Greasy was picked during the Don Shula years, right? Et cetera, and significant differences there. You know, totally different times. The rules were totally different. There wasn't free agency back then. You know, blah, 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 right? So totally different things. The people picking were totally different. So many things have changed since then. So there's that. So, it's fun to look at the history in that regard, but it doesn't necessarily tell you a lot, right? But when you look at the totality of it, there are some interesting things, right? Like, so Dillon Jordan, for example, he was picked during, in 2013, during the Stephen Ross regime. So that actually is applicable to now, right? So, Chris Greer was in the scouting department then, I believe, in 2013. I think he was still in the scouting department at the time, but in the upper ends of the scouting department, right? 2005, Stephen Ross wasn't there yet. He didn't take over the team until a little bit later, I believe, if I'm keeping everything together in my head. But Chris Greer, I think, might have been around at that time. He's been with the team for like 20 something years or some shit like that. He's been with the team for a long time. But anyway, for sure, the most recent, like, that's why I was saying, like, if you look at that, the extremes are Greasy and Dillon Jordan, right? Greasy's the best out of all of the top 5 picks that we've had. Dillon Jordan's the worst. But the best picks come earlier on in different, leadership, with different leadership, and the worst ones come with the current leadership. So it was Stephen Ross that picked Dillon Jordan and whoever he had, and with, Chris Greer in the scouting department or wherever he was at, in the Dolphins organization at that time. They didn't do very good with that, right? So let's see what they do with this. Do they stay put? Do they trade back? Do they trade significant capital up, to go to the number 1 spot? Do they go to the number 3 spot? And then who do they take and how does it pan out? So that's what I got for you guys. I hope you guys enjoy my videos and perspective. If you do, make sure you hit the subscribe button, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the bell if you want to get the alerts. Share my channel and videos with your friends and family. Leave your questions, comments, and concerns down in the comment section. And of course, as always, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Dillon Tartaro. And with that, I am out. I'll see y'all soon. Phins up.